Radio 94.4 FM, bringing you all the latest news from around the local area and around the world. We bring you news from the local area. Our goal is to increase participation and awareness of sports, and we do interviews with world-class athletes, sports people around the world. We've also got a new segment too, speaking to some of the world's best psychologists and leading psychologists, most influential people in mental health too around the world. Today we have a guest who's a legend in boxing, pretty much. It's going to give us a really fantastic insight. We're very fortunate on the show to have some of the world's best athletes, sports people, footballers on the show. And today we've got a fascinating guest all the way from the other side of the world in Australia, who's going to give us a fascinating insight into his career. Jeff Fenech, thank you for coming on board the show. Great to have you on board.
Thank you so much. Lovely to be on the show.
Great, Jeff. So I suppose with a career like yours, where do we begin? And there's so many highlights and sort of pivotal moments. And I suppose we sort of start from the beginning, Jeff. What got you into boxing? What was your motivation to become a boxer?
Yeah, boxing was an accident for me. I never really I wanted to play football, but I went to a youth club. I was in a boxing room, and I ended up walking in there, having a little look. I sat down, and I fell in love with boxing. So I never boxed in my life until I was 17 and a half. Wow. 19, I went to the Olympics. 20 years of age, I was world champion. So I think I was born to fight.
Yeah. It's interesting you say, Jeff, your trainer, Johnny Lewis, what sort of impact did he have on you sort of as a youngster? 17 and a half, you take up boxing and you've got this sort of, meteoric rise in obviously you work really, really hard, no doubt, but, people sort of box for a long time. You seem to, box, for comparatively to some people who box for years and don't reach the heights that you've reached. What influence was the training on yourself, Jeff?
Yeah, I think that he had an immediate impact on my life. It was like he was my dad. If he told me to jump off the harbour bridge, I would jump. He set me these little goals. I was achieving them, and I loved achieving goals. I loved making my people and friends around me happy. Yeah. And like I said, you've got to realise, I went to the Olympics after like 25 fights, fighting people who had 300, 200 fights.
Incredible.
And after, I won my first 3 fights, and on my third fight, for the first time in Olympic boxing history, there was a jury there, and they overturned my decision. So instead of getting a medal, I just jumped on a plane and went home. You just think of this. So when you go to the Olympic Games, you go, you march, and then you have this amazing after party at the Olympics. I couldn't march at the Olympics because I had to fight on the first day, and I had to make weight. After I lost, I got on a plane and went straight home, so I missed the after party. But before I got on the plane and went home, I said they wouldn't let me win a gold medal and I'll win a world title. So I won the world title in the shortest time in history, in 196 days.
Incredible. And did you think at one point, Jeff, after 84, it was controversial, the Olympics, in the sense that was documented that the decision, I think it was the quarterfinals, and did you sort of think maybe I'll have another go, or what was your sort of thoughts after that?
Yeah. No, 100%. I wanted to win a gold medal. But when I went to the Olympics in Australia, they wouldn't let my trainer come with me. So I had to have a neutral trainer, and I said, if they let my trainer come with me, I'll stay amateur for another 4 years. But they said we can't guarantee it, so I turned professional straight away.
Yeah. And so you turn professional, and pretty much straight away you make a big impact on the global stage. You sort of, was it 33 professional wins? You had a number of, KOs. And what would you say was the sort of highlight? There was the Azumah Nelson trilogy, which was huge.
That was all great. Look, winning all my world titles was a highlight. But just have a look. Get the world to have a look at Julio Cesar Chavez's record. In my first 23 fights, I had 13 world title fights. That's never been done in the history of the sport. And then like 6 or 8 of those were 15 rounds. So just have a look at the guys I fought. I fought Daniel Zaragoza, who's a Hall of Famer. I fought Carlos Arane, who's a Hall of Famer. of course, Azumah Nelson. But in my first 23 fights, 23 of all world titles. If you look at Roberto Duran or Chavez, after 40 fights, they're still fighting guys who are on day 2, you know. So in my record, people really don't know my record and what I've done. So for me, I know how remarkable my record and my career has been. But yeah, and it's great for me to be on radio because I will share that. And when people hear me say it, when they go and look at what I've done, I think, wow, that guy done that. This Australian done that.
No, absolutely, it's incredible, and you know what you achieved. And in terms of being inducted in the Boxing Hall of Fame, what did it mean to you, Jeff? Obviously, you know, it's one of the things you look back on, and I suppose in one sense, and it's there forever, and the legacy lives on. What did it feel like to be, you know, recognised internationally to be inducted in the Hall of Fame?
Yeah, it's like the icing on the cake. Yeah, when you know that you've done everything and you get recognised for it. But for me, the greatest recognition is when your peers, you know, appreciate and admire you. When I go overseas and I see Lennox Lewis, Mike Tyson, who I love, who I train, or Roberto, or Ray Leonard, or any of them, they all admire me. They give me amazing credit for what I've done in my career, and that's the ultimate reward. I mean, look, the Hall of Fame is amazing. But when Ray Leonard or when Mike Tyson says, he's my favourite fighter, you can't get better than that.
That's amazing. And with Mike Tyson, you sort of worked with Mike Tyson. I mean, how amazing was that? I mean, how did that come about, Jeff, you know, working with Mike Tyson?
Wow. Yeah, well, I don't really know. Well, we became really close friends prior. Like, we met a few times, and Mike's on TV saying that Jeff Fenech from Australia is my favourite fighter. Wow. And then, you know, I fought on his undercard, and then we became really close. And I went and watched all his fights all around the world, and I did little bits of training with him on my own when nobody knew. We'd run together, we'd do some paddle work together, and then one day I get a call, and he says, Jeff, I'd like you to come over and train me. It was like, wow, bang, you know. It was, I can't even tell you what it felt like. I got told what happened to me. I was in a church at a christening. I was in a holy communion for one of my great friends' son. And when I got the call, when I walked out of church and had the call from Mike Tyson, I said to my wife, "Wow, Mike wants me." So I got on a plane the next day, and it changed my life. Yeah. Mike, you know, trainer Mike Tyson. Yeah, I mean, he's the greatest accolade that anybody can have. You know, I trained one of the greatest humans, one of the greatest fighters that ever lived. And for me, it was sensational.
What was it like working with Mike Tyson, Jeff? I mean, it must have been, obviously, yourself, you sort of, you know, a great fighter yourself, and hugely admired in the boxing world and outside the boxing world as an athlete and as a fighter. But for someone, you know, of your stature as well, to sort of work with Mike Tyson, what was it like in terms of training, just for our listeners to get an insight? Yeah.
Look, to be honest, as great as it was a huge battle because Mike had lost his hunger and he'd lost the desire, the will, and he lost the love, you know. So it was my job to try to reinvent that and do things that were different to make him love training again, love boxing again. And some days I think, wow, we've got it again, and then he would go, you know, then we would lose it again. So it was a really hard job for me, but look, it was a job that I loved and I would take every day of the week because I love Mike Tyson. He's my great friend.
That's really interesting stuff. And in terms of your own career, I mean, you won titles in different weight divisions, free weight divisions. Winning a title in one division is you know, a big achievement. Winning it in two is, you know, but in 3 divisions to win, you know, a title.
Yeah, not just 3, but really 4. And you've got to realise, I was the first boxer in history to win 3 world titles undefeated.
Wow.
I was the first boxer in history to win 3 world titles in the time span. Lomachenko just broke my record recently, but he's been defeated. I was undefeated. So my record, well, hopefully it will stand for a lot longer. But I mean, records are made to be broken.
Absolutely, and to fight in different divisions, like for any sort of young boxer listening, to what you're saying, and to finding what's it like to fight in a different division, Jeff? What's it sort of in terms of your training and just generally adapting to the division? Is it really difficult to do, or just a bit of an insights for any youngsters listening in, thinking, okay, to sort of change division or to step up? What's it like?
Yeah, I think for me, mate, it was kind of a natural progression. Mm-hmm. I was a tall bantamweight. I was a tall super bantamweight. Mm-hmm. So so I was always making weight and dieting and starving myself. Mm-hmm. So it was just a natural progression. But like I said, back at home, I sparred featherweights, lightweights. Jeff Harding, the light heavyweight champ of the world, was one of my main sparring partners. So it was. Wow. For me, I was very, very confident moving up weights.
Yeah, that's really interesting stuff. And in terms of the mental side of boxing, Jeff, I mean, obviously, you've got a lot of mental strength, and how important is it to be and to sort of to be on it mentally when you sort of get in the ring and to focus? Did you do anything in terms of getting yourself in that sort of that place mentally to prepare for fights, or were you?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I did one very, very special thing. And what you just said is the only thing. The mental side of winning is everything. Everybody talks about people with big hearts. Everybody's heart's the same size. Yeah. Your heart don't tell you what to do. Your mind tells you what to do. So the most important thing for me was working hard and letting my mental side of my mind know that I'd worked. I was ready. So I was ready to do anything that I needed to do, and it wasn't for anything else but my mental part of my preparation.
Yeah, that's really interesting stuff. And I mean, in terms of the boxing world itself, you sort of still work as a trainer now. And what do you make of boxing now, Jeff, from what it was when you were sort of in your prime?
Yeah.
It's changed, obviously.
Listen, for me, it's certainly different. I mean, we look at the fighters today, and we look at the guys they're saying a number. I mean, they talk about Lomachenko, and all they talk about really is because he had a crazy amateur career, and he can dance, and he can do all these things. But you've got to be able to fight. You've got to be able to fight as a pro. And for me, and look, there are many better fighters than him. I mean, people are really carried away with everything he does outside the ring. But for me, as a fighter, it's what you do in the ring. Not only has he lost, I mean, look, I'm not saying that he can't fight. He's got great skills and ability. But for me, wow, Roberto Duran. There are so many fighters that would beat these guys today. Yeah. We look at I just think the 80s to 90s were an amazing era. That was the era that I fought in. I'm really proud of it because I fought the best every time, so
absolutely,
I'm proud to be associated with Hagler, Hurst, Leonard, Durant, Tyson, Chavez. Wow, what would Chavez do to these guys today at his prime? It's crazy. But look, all he can do is beat what's in front of you, and I wish everybody the greatest amount of luck. And as long as they work hard and believe in themselves, we can beat anybody.
Yeah, and absolutely. And in making the transition, so we got some youngsters possibly listening who sort of are boxing amateur and have aspirations of going to the Olympics, or maybe have been and thinking about making the transition. What's it like, Jeff, to make the transition from, say, being an Olympic boxer to professional? What's the sort of the goal for?
Well, it's so different today. I mean, the amateurs back in the 80s and 70s. You were serving an apprenticeship to be a great professional, but the amateur today is totally different. It's like you don't punch hard, you just tap. You're looking for points, so it's so different today. So for me, amateur boxing today isn't a great apprenticeship to be a great professional fighter.
Yeah. No, that's interesting stuff. And so, would you say these days, if you sort of go from amateur to pro, you sort of maybe take a bit more time to get to that level, the extra rounds, the intensity as well, all that sort of stuff in the training?
Today I wouldn't be bothered with being an amateur.
Wow.
I would turn pro, and I would practice the professional what you need to do to be a good pro, and and just start. The more sparring you have, the better you're going to be. Get in the gym, train. Like I said, because the amateur and professional game is not the same anymore. Boxing is a little different. So, if you look at amateur and professional boxing today, it's nothing alike. Back in the 70s and 80s, if you're a great amateur, you got great money to a professional. One of those guys today, they would get no money,
Absolutely, that's interesting. To hear that, obviously from someone who's been there and done that. That's a really interesting insight in terms of how things have changed, and really powerful stuff. And I suppose Jeff, you no doubt sort of keep an eye on the boxing. Well, at the moment in the UK, there's a bit of a renaissance with boxers. The heavyweight division. There's Fury. There's Anthony Joshua as well, and the sort of boxing. What do you sort of make of that? Jeff, the sort of heavyweight division now, obviously, you've seen the likes of Tyson and sort of Lewis firsthand, and where do you sort of take it?
They're not coming back. They don't need to get hit anymore. But let me just tell you one thing. Tyson Fury, he could fight in any era. And I'm not, forget about would he win or would he lose, but he has the skill and the mindset to fight. Listen, Anthony Joshua, wow. He needs help. He needs to be trained and to be told how to do these things and what to do. Deontay Wilder, man, he can punch only. And like I would let Mike Tyson, if I was training Mike today, I would let Mike Tyson fight him. And I would be confident of Mike winning because this guy waits for you he waits to punch you. Mike Tyson doesn't let you wait. If Mike hit him, the fight would be over. Still at 53 years of age, So boxing's so different today. But like I said, I look at, Tyson Fury. I look at him and think, wow, what a skillful, great. Yeah, I really like the guy. And the rest, I just think that, I don't know. I don't want to bag anybody or say the wrong thing. But Tyson Fury to me is the most skilled guy out there. I'd like to think that Anthony Joshua, if he was taught properly, that he could do the same thing. But I think that it's the heavyweight division is definitely not the same as it used to be. I looked at Evander Holyfield. I think Evander, being 20 or 15 kilos lighter than those guys, would walk through all of them.
That's really interesting stuff, Jeff. Do you think it's because, Jeff, you mentioned there, back in the day, you had so many like world-class fighters that it just increased the level. I mean, to do what you did when you sort of achieved it, obviously there's a lot of great fighters out there. Do you think that's a lot to do with it, just the actual the level itself?
I will tell you what has more to do with it than that. Is that these guys today in one fight are making more money than shivers we made our whole lives, and they kind of think, like I said, I don't care who's listening or who I'm talking to. Fame and fortune changes everybody's mindset. They think, and like I said, back in the day you had to be hungry, and there were hungry guys there that wanted to kill. You'd be a challenger today. You challenge for a title, for a heavyweight title, and you're set up for life.
That's an interesting point. And the thing is too, Jeff, I was thinking that, I mean, obviously, your generation of fighters just seem to be, more humble than some of the fighters coming through now. I know, obviously, it's a generalisation. Everyone's different, but they seem to be a bit more humble.
No, definitely so. Definitely so. To hear Deontay Wilder and them guys, even if they could beat Mike Tyson, to say they could is disrespectful. But let me tell you one thing. Just send Anthony Joshua to Australia for 2 weeks with me, and I'll send him back ready to beat anybody ever.
That'd be interesting stuff. So for
Listen,
sure.
Let me tell you what they have today. We have a lot of trainers, but we don't have teachers. Anybody can train somebody. Anybody can tell somebody to punch a bag or punch a pads, but it's the person who can tell somebody what to do to make you better, or how to do it, or how to get more power, or how to make so. And there aren't too many of those guys out there today.
Absolutely. And the thing is, I suppose from the point of view, from the coaching point of view yourself, Jeff, sort of having been there and done it yourself, I mean, how much of your experience can you sort of share with young people? I mean, I guess it's priceless, an hour with yourself just to sort of...
You know what? Yeah. You know what? It's really funny that you can be the greatest fighter in the world, but you can't be a good teacher. It's all right. But I honestly believe that I'm going to be a better trainer than I was a fighter, which is a big statement. But I know that I can teach people. I know that I don't teach. I show people how to make them feel better. Like I said, give me Anthony Joshua, give me even Fury. I know Fury's going to change trainers now and things. Then give me those guys for 1 week and I'll make them feel that. I'll make them feel like they're invincible. They've never felt like that before. Listen, the art of being a trainer is when somebody comes back down and sits in the corner, you say, listen, you just need to do this or you need to do that, and it changes the whole fight.
Absolutely. And
I know I've got the ability to do that.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I mean, yourself, obviously, you walk into a gym at 17 and a half, and your trainer sees that you've got something there. From your point of view, Jeff, what do you look for in terms of any young fighters listening when they sort of walk through the gym and think, well, there's something about that person?
The first thing you look for is that they want to be there, they love being there, and then you work with them. If they love what they're doing, then it's a great combination. And look, the most important thing is me as a father, me as a person. If I was going to send my son or my daughter to do a sport, the first thing I would do is my homework on the teacher or the trainer. I want to make sure this guy, he knows what he's doing. I want to make sure this person's going to be able to tell my son or daughter, this is what you need to do, and this is how you do it. And also, I'd like to think that they've done it before. Yeah. They haven't read a book. They haven't looked at TV. They've done it before. They've been there. They've been involved in the whole scheme of the system. It's very important.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And in terms of the young fighters, I mean, what would you sort of say would be the biggest focus, Jeff? Like technique, fitness, or mental strength? What are sort of the areas that you think?
No. Listen, I mean, of course, technique's everything. Being able to teach somebody how to do things properly is of utmost importance. But then you've got to have somebody there that's willing to work harder than anybody else. But listen, when I went to bed every night, my trainer never had to ask me, "Did you run in the morning?" I ran every morning. So you've got to have somebody who loves doing what they're doing, that you have a great communication with, and then if you've got a good, as individual as the sport of boxing is, it's a great team sport as well. Because I love the boys who I train. I love, and I show them love, and then they show me respect. And in respect, they give me 110% every day. We've got an amazing, with my fighters, I've got an amazing bond, association. We have a gift together because they know that my job is, first of all, to make them the best they can be. Second of all, is to make sure they're safe and healthy. And third of all, and the most for me, is to make sure we make we make the most money I can for my fighter.
Absolutely, and interesting stuff. And say, as a trainer now, Jeff, you're a trainer now. Obviously, you sort of see things different to the way you would have seen them as a fighter in some respects. But if a 17-year-old, Jeff Fenech walked through the door now as a youngster, what advice would you give? Starting the career, you've had this illustrious career. There's so much you can offer a young person.
Again, I would just say, love what you do. If you don't love it, if you don't love something, you can't give your all. And make sure you're with somebody who you enjoy being with. I mean, it's no use, training with somebody that when you get home, when you leave. When you wake up in the morning, you got to say, man, I can't wait to get to the boxing gym. I can't wait because I'm going to get taught something today. I can't wait because I'm going to be better than I was yesterday. And if we're not going to be better than we were the day before, we're wasting our time. If we're not going to improve every day or feel we're getting better, we're wasting our time.
And obviously, you love what you do, and you've had this sort of incredible career. Only a few people can dream of having a sort of career like yourself in any professional sport. What's your vision going forward, Jeff? You still seem as motivated now as you sort of you probably were as a fighter in some respects. What sort of
of course. I train a group of young boys who want to make sure that first of all, every time they fight, they're not just physically ready, but they're mentally ready. Second, I want to make sure that I look after their health. And third, I want to make sure that I look after their welfare. And I want to make sure that my ultimate aim is to make sure that every one of my boxers are set up for life. They have a few properties that because if worst thing comes to worst and they lose, I want to make sure that on the way up there I get them sponsored. I have them I have them managed right. I have them I make them some money, so all the hard work they've done, they look and think, wow, whether they're the best fighter in the world, whether the second best or the last best. Wow, Jeff Fenech, look, I own these two properties because my trainer and manager make sure they look after me. That's my job. That's my priority. Look after my fighter.
Yeah, that's really powerful stuff. I think that's really powerful stuff. And there's a lot of coaches, trainers out there across a wide range of sports that think purely on the basis of achieving in sport. But beyond that, sport is a short career, and like he says, it's difficult. Because in every sport, and boxing's no exception, there's a lot of people out there that are sort of, the hangers-on, Jeff, as well, that are out there too.
Yeah. And just one more thing one of my famous sayings is, I will always stop the fight a little early than a little late. I will always think of my fighter's welfare and health before I think of him, before winning the belt. My first and foremost priority is the health and welfare of my fighter.
That's powerful stuff. And just sort of one more thing, Jeff, I was thinking. We have a lot of sports people listen to the show, and a lot of people sort of not just in boxing, but across a wide range of areas. And is there sort of any sort of words of wisdom you can sort of pass on to any young person looking to be a professional, be it a footballer, a boxer, a cricket player? Any sort of thoughts that you can sort of share with anyone aspiring to sort of be a world champion in anything really?
Yeah, like I said, for me, there's like I said, I don't have any rules or laws, but my rule is that when you walk into the door of my gym or wherever we're going to be, that we're not going to train for it. We're going to do the best quality work, and I'm going to teach you. I'm not going to say to punch the bag, or I'm not going to say hook the bag or uppercut the bag. I'm going to show you how to do it. I'm going to make sure that when I show you what to do, you're going to feel better, and you're going to walk out of there thinking, wow, today I was taught something.
That's really powerful stuff.
I wasn't told to do something. Today I was taught how to do something.
That's powerful stuff, and I want to thank you for coming on board the show, Jeff. It's been phenomenal insight, and no doubt our listeners have enjoyed and hung on to every word that you've said there, and been really, really powerful stuff, Jeff. So thank you for coming on board the show, Salford City Radio.
Thank you. I hope everybody enjoyed it.
Absolutely.
And just one message I want to get to everybody out there that's training or looking after youth, and think of the health and welfare before anything else, and think that these guys are going to have a life after their sport, and that's the most important thing.
Yeah, powerful stuff. Thanks for that, Jeff. Really appreciate that, and no doubt our listeners have really enjoyed and hung on to every word that you've spoken. Salford City Radio 94.4FM, bringing you all the news from around the local area, around the world. It was Jeff Fenech, who doesn't need any introduction, inducted into the Boxing Hall of Fame, has an incredible boxing career, who's given us an insight into his world, and we could have interviewed him for as many hours as we've got in a day, and there's so many stories to share. But thanks, Jeff, been a great interview, and we wish you all the best. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you, bye.
So you're listening to Salford City Radio 94.4 FM with your host Jimmy Petruzzi on the Friday Sports Show, bringing you all the latest news from the local area and around the world. And we're very fortunate in this show to have some of the world's best athletes, sports people who work in sport across a broad range of areas, but also our new segment that's going really, really well, interviewing some of those influential people in the field of psychology and related fields. We've had some really huge names over the last few weeks to give us some really fascinating insights into different domains of psychology. Today we have a Professor of Arts and Health from the University of West London, Professor Victoria Tischler. She's going to give an insight into her work, which is truly fascinating. She's worked in sport as well, and she's got an abundance of experience, and we've got a really interesting evening tonight listening to Victoria speak about her work and what she does. So, Victoria, thank you for coming on board the show. Can you tell us a bit about what you do, the listeners about what you do, please?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Jimmy. It's great to be here. I'm Professor of Arts and Health. It's quite an unusual job title, but I think it really describes my background as a psychologist. I've got a PhD in psychology, but my work involves directly collaborating with people from the arts and humanities. So I work a lot with artists and musicians and looking at using the power of the arts to improve people's health and well-being.
Wow, that's really fascinating stuff. And what inspired you to go into the field? What was your inspiration to go into the field of psychology and move towards the creative area that you've moved into?
Yeah, I've always been interested in people and, how people behave and how they think and how they feel. So I've always had an interest in working with people, but I was always really creative as a young person, but came from a family, which really valued scientific endeavor over sort of artistic endeavor. So I studied psychology and, that really, I've spent most of my career, over 20 years, working with people with mental health problems mainly. But I've always had this kind of creative part of me which I wanted to express. And then in the past sort of 7 or 8 years, I found this new field of arts and health, which, kind of brings together my personal passion for arts and creativity with my professional background in psychology.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And for our listeners who aren't so familiar in the world of psychology, many people are familiar with your work and know that I've sort of read your work and looked into it. I've certainly read some of your work as well, and I find it really interesting. For people who aren't really familiar with the world of psychology in terms of how it works, can you give a bit of an insight into how you would incorporate art into learning and teaching? I know it's a broad area, and it's one that's obviously, we could speak about it for forever, really. But just a bit of an insight on how you incorporate art in learning and teaching.
I think it goes back to, I taught medical students for over a decade, and what I found was that lots of medical students, when I interviewed prospective applicants, came into medical school with lots of sort of interests in music. They played grade 8 piano, or one of them had written and published a children's book. Lots of them were accomplished artists, and they came into medical school and really didn't have time at all to pursue those creative interests because they had so much kind of heavy academic work to do. So that made me think, it would be a real shame if we didn't try and think about how we could actively use the arts in medical education. Wow. Also, as part of my role, I had a pastoral role, so I was involved in supporting medical students who had mental and physical health problems. And I thought how the arts can be really healing as well as, enjoyable for people's mental health and to help people recover from physical health. So I started using the arts actively as part of my teaching when I taught medical students. And then I found there were this group of medical students who were really, really interested in being creative. And it's almost like they needed to be given permission, within their healthcare professional role to use the arts. And, that started a really flourishing body of work in regards to teaching medical students, but also doing research, looking at some of the mental health benefits of the arts for healthcare professionals. So that was the sort of starting point. And then I I was really inspired in terms of my research. I visited the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and they pioneered a program called Meet Me at MoMA, which was for people with Alzheimer's disease, and they brought people with Alzheimer's disease and their carers into the museum to look at artwork and to discuss artwork. And a colleague and I thought we would start to do that kind of work here in the UK. So inspired by that, we started a whole program of research looking at using visual arts to stimulate people with dementia to improve their behavior and their cognition and sometimes their memory, to improve their communication. And that's led to a whole series of collaborations with art galleries up and down the country.
That's really fascinating stuff. And how have you found that they respond, Victoria? How's the sort of response been with patients with dementia and art? What's the sort of, I know everyone's different and they'll have their own sort of response, but as a just sort of general rule, how do you find the responses?
Well, it's generally it's very, very positive, and I wouldn't recommend that everybody with Alzheimer's disease goes to an art gallery, but for some people it works really, really well. And I think there's a combination of things at play. One is that art can be quite ambiguous and quite nebulous and is open to interpretation. So that's really important when you're working with people with dementia who perhaps, might have problems with their memory or might have problems with recognizing forms or being able to name things that they see. So that idea of being able to discuss a piece of art, it can be really empowering. And art also is about really powerful human experiences and emotions often. So I think art opens up that space to have what we call meaningful conversations with people who perhaps people make assumptions, that they aren't capable of having those kind of discussions anymore. And that's been really powerful for the person with dementia, but also for their family carers or for professional carers that work with them. And I think the other thing is that cultural venues like museums and galleries tend to often have really incredible atmospheres, often when you go into a museum. So think about going into the British Museum, there's people gasping and whispering and taking photos. People are often awe-inspired by the objects in there, but also the ambience of the gallery and the setting. And I think that's really powerful for members of the community, like people with dementia who perhaps feel socially isolated or ostracized from the community, which is often what happens when you have mental health problems. You become, very isolated, and perhaps you don't feel part of the community or able to take part. So these cultural institutions can play a really important role in people's health.
Yeah, that's really fascinating stuff. And also, you sort of mentioned music as well, and poetry, literature, drama. How different are those sort of modalities, those sort of domains? I mean, there are some sort of parallels, like you've mentioned there, with art being ambiguous and people make their own meaning and it can evoke a set of emotions. But is it the same sort of principle with music, poetry, literature, or is that sort of different? What's your take on that area?
It's different, and I think that it's a really exciting field to work in because I think there's so much we're still uncovering. In terms of different modalities, like you said, music is probably there's probably the most research being done in that area. So there's the most evidence for how music works, and there's some really interesting neuroscience evidence about music in terms of looking at different parts of the brain which respond when people either play music or listen to music. And of course, music is so diverse, so it could be that playing different types of music appeal to people in different ways. It could be that just listening to music, and there's been some really interesting projects using technology as well, where you can upload people's favorite music onto an iPod, and people can listen to these personalized playlists. So there's a growing body of evidence, and I think initially the evidence was a bit weak, but I think now there's a growing body of quite good evidence for why things like music or visual arts work. And I think the other thing about the arts is that, even if you've got a mental health condition like dementia or schizophrenia or bipolar, we're all different individuals. So what appeals to one person won't appeal to someone else. And I think that diversity in the arts can be really harnessed to provide what we call bespoke or individualized approaches to the care of different people. So it's a really exciting field to work in, because I feel like we're finding out more every day, but there's still lots more work to be done. And it's great to work alongside creative practitioners like musicians, because I find that really stimulates my own way of thinking, but also I think the real breakthroughs for certain conditions like dementia, for which that we don't have a cure, I think that's where we'll find the really exciting breakthroughs.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really interesting stuff. And what I find interesting from the music point of view as well is, like you've mentioned there, different sort of music has a different sort of effect on different people. Are there any sort of types of music that have been researched more than others, or just is this a sort of generally speaking, music in general?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure about whether some types of music have been researched more than others. There's certainly been a lot done on classical, but I wouldn't say that I could say, for example, if you listen to the blues, there's more evidence that the blues are beneficial for your mental health. So I think, it's a bit hard to be that specific, but generally music is very, very beneficial to mental health. And one interesting fact is that, when we feel depressed, it's not happy music that people turn to. It's often kind of the more melancholic music, which can actually improve people's mood.
Yeah, and absolutely, it's really interesting stuff. And it's music in general, I think, is something that we can all generally relate to. I'm sure a lot of listeners can relate to. Whenever we sort of find ourselves in a variable mood, sometimes you sort of listen to a type of tune, but even for that moment as well, for those sort of few minutes, you can just sort of lose yourself in music as well. But it's interesting you say, so there are sort of studies on the brain to see what happens in the brain when music is on. That's really fascinating stuff. And where do you think those studies can sort of take us? I mean, I think that's really important that it is researched, and we've got people like yourself looking into it and researching it. But I mean, in terms of the research, is there any sort of research suggest that there's sort of permanent change, or just in that moment? Like, is there sort of longitudinal studies, or is it just basically at that point in time when they're listening to music is when some of the brain engages in those changes?
There's a bit of both, but there's a need for more longitudinal studies and more sort of randomized trials as well. I think one of the interesting things about in-the-moment findings, which, perhaps people might not be so excited about, but certainly for someone who works in dementia research like myself, where you're dealing with people who perhaps have moments of lucidity. So if you're thinking about someone with advanced dementia who may have no verbal speech left, but even for a moment, if you play music or if you show them an artwork, suddenly that person responds. They might open their eyes, you might see their foot tapping really slightly, but in that moment that person is present and they're responding. And that's really, really powerful for that individual, but also for the people working with them, because I think there's a lot of misery narratives about dementia that, it's a sort of living death, and that people are written off, and it's just degenerative, there's no improvement. But I think if even those moments, where people can have a quality of life, that's really important in and of itself, even if they don't remember what happens afterwards. But interestingly, I have been involved in some studies where we've taught people with moderate dementia, we've taught them new artistic skills, so skills that they didn't know before, and they have remembered those skills afterwards. So this idea that you can't teach an older person something new, and that you can't teach an older person who has cognitive impairment something new, that is just not true. And I'm constantly remind myself, never to make assumptions about what someone is able to do, because I think often it's about a verbal barrier. We rely so much on verbal communication that if someone can't say something or respond to a command, we assume that they're not responding. But of course, there's really powerful non-verbal ways of understanding what's happening with someone, which I think the arts really elicit.
Absolutely, and I suppose in one sense, the sort of the research that you do and sort of the work that you do, would it be possible to sort of maybe sort of point research in the direction of understanding more about the brain when it is affected by dementia, and sort of what parts of the brain are affected more than others? Is that sort of a possibility, you think, like using these sort of these sort of processes like music and drama, poetry, and sort of recognising how people engage in these sort of modalities with dementia. Is that possible to sort of maybe give research and insight into what parts of the brain are actually affected in dementia?
Yeah, there's been some interesting imaging studies. There's particularly some colleagues in Scandinavia, in Norway in particular, who've done some really interesting imaging studies, and we could do with more of those. Funding is always an issue in this area, and when I started off in my research in this area, we were doing studies on a shoestring, but now I've been involved in studies where we've got over £1 million funding, where we can do much more robust longitudinal multi-centre studies. So like I said, the evidence is getting better, and there's also, I think there's a real political will to get this area going. So you and your listeners might have heard about social prescribing, which is really starting to take off. So that's where, the doctor recommends that you, listen to music maybe, to help with your depression, or that you go and do some gardening. And there's also an all-party parliamentary group for arts, health and well-being who, produced a report in 2017 called Creative Health, which really advocated for increased research activity around the use of arts for a whole range of physical and mental health conditions, from the cradle to the grave, basically. Yes. So this field is gaining traction. So it's a really exciting time to be working in this area.
Absolutely. And I read a few research papers on sort of neurogenesis and cells producing in the brain. Is there anything around that as well? I mean, I personally, what I try and do every day is do something different, or right, left-handed, or try and do something different, learn something new, just to engage the brain and see if I can get some new cells going, type thing. But is there any sort of research around that, Victoria, that possibly we can generate new cells in the brain with different activity?
I'm not sure about that, because I haven't been involved in that kind of research specifically. But what I can say, after what you've just said, is that's all really good for minimising your risk factor for developing dementia when you get older. Yes. So anything like that, doing, keeping active cognitively, learning another language, learning a musical instrument, doing those kind of things, that's all really good for your brain health.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's really interesting stuff that you say. And I think on top of that, from a motivation point of view, sort of setting these sort of small goals and focusing on certain areas, and just generally, keeping motivated and sort of keeping going, and which is quite useful. But I mean, it's really interesting. Sort of, obviously, for yourself, you talk about music and poetry, literature. How's that been taken in the world? I mean, you mentioned also sort of some GPs now sort of talking about gardening, and I mean, how's it sort of been for you, Victoria? What are sort of challenges when you sort of first went into this sort of research, or was it generally mapped out and people were accepting of it in the sort of field?
I think kind of, 8 years ago, it was quite niche, and there was a lot of skepticism, perhaps wasn't seen as very scientifically robust. Yeah. But I think, like I said, the political will, and I think the fact that there's more of an acknowledgement about holistic health, and that, brain and physical health are interrelated, and that in order to treat a person, you need to treat the whole person, and that includes thinking about a whole range of things which might be valuable. And that brings in the arts really, really nicely. But I think the evidence just wasn't there, and it's still not there altogether, but that means there's an opportunity for people like me and my doctoral students to do loads more work in this area, which is great.
Absolutely, and we'll definitely keep an eye out for the work that you do. And I mean, how do you see the impact of the arts and humanities in healthcare in general? I mean, we can sort of see it now moving forward, and people being more accepting of it with the research. But where do you sort of see it going yourself in terms of your experience and where you are now?
Well, I think it's I think it's mutually, there's a reciprocal benefit, because I think for the cultural institutions, sometimes they're having to really fight hard to justify their existence. I think there's a lot of pressure with, the emphasis on STEM for the arts to justify their existence. So in a pragmatic way, as well as any scientific way, I think it's beneficial for them. But also, cultural organizations which are funded by the taxpayer, they need to demonstrate that they reach out to a whole range of different communities. And we know that even if museums and galleries are free and welcoming, there's a very limited demographic that actually visit those institutions. So I think anything they can do to reach out to the community and use their resources for the public good is a really good thing. And for me, it's an opportunity to do novel research, because, I find that the insights that creative practitioners bring really challenge my ideas and my training, and, think of possible solutions to problems where we need them. For example, how best to provide a good quality of life for someone with Alzheimer's disease, which is a really difficult and challenging area for people who work in care homes. And these are they're potential solutions if we find the evidence for their effectiveness.
That's really an interesting point you've made. Then, sort of quality of life. I think that it sort of goes to show that even in certain situations, people can still have some quality or quality of life by experiencing, art and music and different things like poetry as well. And in terms of yourself, I mean, what is your vision for art, science, and creativity and health in general? You've come a long way with the work that you do. It's amazing, and it's well recognised. And where do you sort of see? What's your vision going forward for what you do?
Well, I have a dream about this transforming the way services are delivered for older people, but also the way older people are perceived in society. I found, not through any conscious choice, but I found myself becoming more and more of an ambassador for older people. And if we talk about the current situation, I mean, I've been watching horrified, like I hope a lot of the population have, about what's been happening in care homes, about
absolutely.
the frank disregard for older people who've spent most of their lives making a contribution to society, basically left to perish. Absolutely, in large numbers. Yeah. I mean, it's a scandal. It's wrong. And I've visited a lot of care homes, and there are some really great care homes, but there are some appalling care homes as well. And those people are looked after. I mean, increasingly the private sector has moved in now, so of course they're interested in profit. There's some. I don't want to say they're all private providers are poor. They're not, but where there's an incentive to make money, I think that's an issue.
Yes.
People who work as carers are amongst the lowest paid. They're looking after the most vulnerable people in society, people who've made a valuable contribution, people who are our fellow citizens, and they're being paid practically nothing. There's no career structure for them. And I think I see my work as fitting into a sort of not just improving services, but fitting into trying to lobby for the better provision for older people. And I think working with the arts really can reframe how people are perceived. And one of my projects is called the Imagination Cafe, and it was built around artwork which was made by people with dementia. And the work was not made to be exhibited as artwork, but was actually they were research artifacts that were going to be thrown away. But I was struck by how aesthetically interesting and intriguing the work was, and I thought we shouldn't throw that away. What if we exhibited that like artwork? What if we took that artwork around? And I think what the arts can do, as well as being therapeutic for people with dementia, they can also change the way the public think about people with dementia. Because if you look at the newspapers, I mean, there's lots of images of wrinkly hands and people hunched over Zimmer frames, but people with dementia can be accomplished artists, and they still have something to contribute to society. And I think that's again where the arts can kind of provide an alternative way of showing the abilities of people who are older, but also of giving the public an opportunity to talk about a condition which is the most feared of all conditions. And I think that the public really need those opportunities to be able to talk about it and to share their fears, and also to find out that there is some hope as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's really powerful stuff, and you're certainly very passionate about what you do, and it's really fascinating how you integrate art and with sort of research and science as well. And just for our listeners as well, I mean, you've done some work as well with Harlequins as well. Can you give us an insight into the work that you've done there, Victoria?
Yeah, so I mentioned the Imagination Cafe, and that's really the starting point. So I was approached by the Harlequins and another charity I work with called CW Plus, which is a hospital charity, to develop a collaboration. And Harlequins Foundation is the Harlequins Rugby Club's charity, and they were interested in using their facilities for the benefit of their local community. And like a lot of rugby clubs, I think, were quite concerned about retired players and the link between head injury and later development of dementia. So that was our starting point, and I think it might be interesting for people who are listening to this to think about those sporting facilities which are used really heavily on match day, but when it's not match day, rugby stadiums have all these different rooms and suites and bars which, could be used for other things, for other functions. So the Harlequins Foundation has generously provided some of their function rooms on a regular basis for us to run this Imagination Cafe. And the Imagination Cafe, like I said, started with this idea of creating a pop-up cafe decorated with artwork made by people with dementia. But I've toured it across the country, including going up to Scotland and into Wales. And on each site, this pop-up cafe is slightly different, so it depends on where it is. So in the Harlequins, we have rugby memorabilia. We have like the cups that the clubs won on the tables. We have really delicious food, which is being created by specialist caterers. So it's developed for people with dementia who might have problems with smell or swallowing, but everything is really small and really sweet and really beautiful to look at. So there's a lovely celebratory sort of morning tea, and then we have bands come in playing music and people dance, and there's art activities. So it's like a big party with a lovely kind of cake and coffee and tea, which everybody loves. And people come along, with dementia, people come along who are carers, people come along who live in the local community, the players come, the coaches come, everybody just kind of joins in together, and it's a really great fun event which we've been running regularly. And sadly, because of the pandemic, we haven't had one for a couple of months, but I can't wait to get back down there because it's really taken off. And I think it brings, working with a rugby club, it brings a different audience. So there's more men, that would come to one of my normal events, because dementia mainly affects women. So we've got a lot of older men coming, which is great. And I think it's that, interaction between the players and the club and members of the community that's really captured people's imagination and makes it a great event.
No, that's really fascinating stuff. Absolutely, that's really, really powerful stuff. And it's been really fascinating having you on the show. It's been wonderful. So the time has sort of flown by, but no doubt we'll sort of keep in touch with what you're doing and any sort of developments. Hopefully, you can let us know. But really want to thank you for coming on board the show. That was Professor Victoria Tischler, Professor of Arts and Health at the University of West London, who is doing some fascinating work in research and just an insight into what she does and how she amalgamates art and science is really fascinating. So listening to Salford City Radio 94.4 FM, your host Jimmy Petruzzi. So thanks again, Victoria, for being on the show. It's been a really fascinating insight, no doubt, for our listeners.
You're welcome.